Hello and welcome to episode 126 of our SAP on Azure video podcast. Today is January 12th, and together with Robert and Goran, we're here to talk about anything related to SAP and Microsoft. Hello, everyone.
Hi.
So we already had a lot of sessions on how to set up an SAP system on Azure, how to secure your SAP system, how to do backup and restores, how to integrate SAP with other systems, and so on. And now, if you want to really set up your SAP system in a not only high avail, but also disaster recovery way, then obviously you need to follow some guidelines, some best practices. And luckily, we have Dennis Padia joining us today, who will talk about some guidelines that were recently published on the Microsoft Learn page. But before we take a closer look at the document and have Dennis walk us through this, let us actually, as always, take a quick look at some of the news from this week. And I do want to start with one document that was published by Bachmann, I'm butchering the name here, the last name, on the CDC connector. So we talked about this before in the past, and we had Ulrich Christ on the show, who talked about the Azure Data Factory connector that allows you to connect to the SAP system and retrieve data from the SAP system. And here, Bachmann basically talks about his experience and how you can use this, how you can connect to this, what is Azure Data Factory. So basically a similar look at the whole topic, but through his eyes. And I thought that was quite interesting to see that yeah, I mean, we see a lot of customers and partners obviously using the new CDC connector, and it's great to see others jumping and also blogging about this as well. As a follow-up to a blog post that I mentioned already last week, there is a new one on the SAP Business One integration. So in this blog post, basically we continue the story on how to get the event from Business One, and then how you can work with this event data in Logic Apps, so on the Azure side. So basically here in this blog post is then outlined what you do with the event. So you get the event from SAP Business One, then what you do on the Logic App side. So how can you actually work with the data? And then, yeah, do some here in this specific case. He just sends an email to do something with the information. But I think when you read through this blog post from Moshe, you can definitely see that the potentials. So now you have the connectivity to SAP Business One, and with the integration into Azure, you can very easily, without any additional components, use this to retrieve additional information and then obviously to integrate in other scenarios as well. So I know we do not talk too often about Business One, but I thought obviously there are, I don't know how many 10,000s of customers out there already using SAP Business One, and I thought this was a really nice blog post to also show the integration of Business One with other Azure services. The next one is again a little more to the ERP system, going back to the ERP S4HANA, no, not S4HANA system, but ECC systems. And Goran, you've found some new informations.
A nice blog from Gert from NetApp. Basically, he's talking about AzAcSnap, which exists is there. So enabling application consistent backup of the database and supporting HANA and Oracle. And he's talking about how to use this with Azure NetApp to do the backup, and also to do a scenario like a system refresh. So system refresh will basically back up the original database, drop in a productive system, and restore it actually on a dev test system, so with the same data. And he is also showing, if you go a bit down, how Exactly. So this is interesting picture. I mean, NetApp is using this snapshot technology, which is basically very quick. They don't do any kind of copying of the stuff. They're just freezing the blocks, so to say, and then just continuing with the deltas. And this enables them basically to very quickly do the snapshot, and then also from snapshot do the restore as well in a quick time, so without the downtime. Yeah, and then he's also explaining how to do the restore, how to do the refresh, actually refresh as a scenario. So nice stuff. No downtime, very quick. So I mean, this is one of the interesting and always useful scenarios from a customer side.
Yeah.
And the next one would be about the Microsoft Defender for Linux. So maybe the Windows guys, if they have Windows clients, they know the Defender is kind of default kind of tool that comes for free. It's actually a kind of, it's an antivirus, but also endpoint detection and response. There's a version for the Linux, and interesting. So then Cameron did a nice blog talking about how this can be done with the SAP. An interesting part is as well that he's also mentioning and telling, okay, please do exclude the SAP files from it. And this is also what SAP is telling if you go to the next to the SAP notes as well. So they're talking about the HANA appliances, where they say, okay, please do exclude HANA data and HANA log. And the next SAP note is generally about the SAP on Linux, telling also similar stuff, just more kind of user SAP stuff. And then because they are just kind of more or less SAP is neutral, they say we can't test every single antivirus vendor. We do not say yes or no. If you have an issue, they have to be kind of disabled. Generally, they said exclude those SAP files from it. So I think interesting if the customers are having, I mean, they could use both from Windows and Linux, and I mean, it's the same product, so to say. Yeah. Nice
but
stuff.
It's interesting that we really see this now also on Linux. I think a few years ago, well, it was always, well, Linux, you don't need to care about viruses or antivirus software.
Yeah.
But now, I mean, that was just because it was not so popular. But obviously now with also SAP HANA running, demanding Linux, I think there's definitely another threat attack vector, I would say.
And it's not your father's Microsoft, you know.
Yeah.
Since years.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
Cool, thank you.
All right.
So with this time a little faster than usual, but that gives us more time to you, Dennis. Dennis, for those of you, I mean, you have been on the show before. You had a really interesting. We had an interesting session on single sign-on, Fiori integration, app gateway. Now we're talking about something completely different. So for those of our viewers and listeners who have not visited or watched your previous show, maybe you can quickly introduce yourself, and then let's take a closer look at the documentation.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Holger, and everyone. Like it's been great to be back in your channel. I'm Dennis. I'm basically part of engineering team in Azure Specialized in Microsoft that focuses on SAP workload on Azure. So my role in my team is basically my focus area is basically to create the reference architecture of SAP workload on Azure with respect to, as you already mentioned, on creating like how the integration of single sign-on and Fiori integration happens with application gateway with respect to disaster recovery, high availability business objects, SAP IQ, some of the areas which I worked and I'm working on. And basically our team focuses on creating all this reference architecture and work on certifying VMs and all that stuff. So that being said, right now, we have recently published our disaster recovery guidelines for SAP workload on Azure. So I will be walking through that in this session. So we will be talking more on deep dive on like what all things needs to be considered, what all things like needs to be additionally evaluated when you are designing your disaster recovery on Azure. So with that being said, let me share my screen.
Perfect. Yeah.
Okay. You able to see the screen?
Yes.
Yep. Can you just put fonts a little bit bigger? So 125 will be good. Okay.
Okay.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. So as many people have already been working on this Azure, so in Azure we have different deployment option like to basically improve the redundancy of SAP workload. So when I say deployment option is like you can deploy your SAP workload in availability set or in availability zone. But this option deploying in availability set, availability zone basically provides the redundancy from at the hardware level or at from the zonal level. So when I say zonal, so when in Azure, the regions, there are regions which consist of one or more availability zones. So, and this availability zone are basically separated through via certain distances and have independent power, cooling, and everything. So earlier, before availability zone comes into place, there was only a region where a single region with no availability zone was there. So at that point of time, customer were asking like, how can I improve the redundancy in that particular region from the hardware maintenance and all that stuff. So we introduced the concept of availability set, where you will be distributing your VM in different fault domain and update domain. So part of your VMs doesn't get impacted if certain things happens on one of the hardware. But things has improved and we expanded and we introduced region with availability zones. So now with availability zone, you can distribute your VM across different availability zone and basically install your SAP system to improve more, have more redundancy. So this havability concept basically improves the redundancy from day-to-day operations of from plant maintenance or from something like a failure in the one of the hardware and all that stuff. But this both option doesn't provide you the guarantee that if something happens on that particular region, so in that particular region, availability zone is basically separated within certain miles or certain kilometers. Okay, but if something happens on that particular region, then you have to make sure that your application survives and your application is available in different regions. So in order to make sure that you can achieve that, you need to set up the disaster recovery for your SAP workload. So that's what this guideline is all about, like how can you set up the disaster recovery for your SAP workload in general. As I think most of the folks will be familiar, like disaster recovery concept is not new, and it's been there from on-premise. The principle and concept that has been followed to design the on-premise DR solution that applies in Azure as well. So it's like there is nothing new, but there are some additional consideration that needs to be evaluated when you are designing a disaster recovery on Azure. Because as Azure being a public cloud, there are regions, there are availability zones, and there are services that basically being offered in Azure. So you need to evaluate all this stuff based on your setup in your primary region. So with that being said, like the idea of like when this disaster recovery is been initiated, so if someone wants to basically protect their application from the wide geographic disaster, at that point of time, it's not that it's usually disaster recovery is not automated. It's basically a human call to basically initiate the disaster recovery, and it's not like your part of your system is running on the disaster recovery region and some is running on the primary region. It's basically, it's not a feasible solution. So it's a human-centric decision on when to initiate this disaster recovery, on what circumstances they need to initiate this disaster recovery. Okay. When we're talking about this SAP workload, it doesn't mean that you don't consider your non-SAP workload as well, because we are familiar that the business runs on SAP workload, so it is most critical system. But it may happen that your SAP system is integrated to your non-SAP application like middleware, where your iDocs are flowing from your middleware to the SAP system. So in that case, basically, you need to consider that all that SAP, non-SAP application as well as some of the basic service with respect to Active Directory, DNS server. So all these systems needs to be evaluated as well, that it is available on your disaster recovery region, because just bringing up the SAP workload, it may happen that some of the features or some of the end-to-end process might not be running because of the some other systems are not available on the disaster recovery. Anything someone was saying?
Yeah, sorry, and I just wanted to interject because when we look at HA solution or something like that, they're always automated. I think there's never someone who pulls the trigger or pushes a button to do high availability. But for disaster recovery, I think it's never easy. I mean, doing a disaster recovery has a lot of impact, and exactly this integration with non-SAP systems or connected systems, let's call it like that. That's such a big issue because, that's why I think a lot of customers are very careful to say, well, do we really need to do a disaster recovery now? Or is there a chance that we will get back up again with our system? So I think that's why this whole setup and the guidelines and the best practices are so important for disaster recovery.
Yeah, you got it right, Holger. Yes, that is why, like, because it's a costly affair, like to initiate disaster recovery in terms of operation, and because you need to fail it back to your primary region as well. So it needs to be calculated. It needs to be evaluated. Like if some of the services are not available, if it is available within certain duration, then it's not useful to switch over the initiate the disaster recovery. So all that fundamental needs to be evaluated, but in order to evaluate all that stuff, but you need a basically end-to-end practice, like because the guidelines that we are mentioning is basically is a generic guidelines which needs to be evaluated based on what customer has implemented, and they need to basically have that end-to-end implementation, has basically do a test of the disaster entire end-to-end disaster recovery, so they are aware. And it's always advisable to frequently do that testing of disaster recovery, because it's like over the period of time your system changes, things changes, so that you are aware that your end-to-end disaster recovery works in case certain events happens, and you have that smooth transition to the business and you are not impacted that much, and you achieve your RTO and RPO that was been designed for your business. So as I mentioned, the fundamentals of this disaster recovery stays the same, the principle and concept as that of an on-premise. Here also we are trying, like the business has to identify what should be their RTO and RPO, because in high availability, people usually, like from hardware failure and all that, people try to achieve the zero RTO and RPO. But for disaster recovery, as you are separating that to a certain distance, it may happen that you there will be certain data loss or anything. So it needs to be evaluated by the business that how much data loss they can basically financially they can accept, okay, and how fast they can recover their system, because like as the disaster recovery, you can basically have that end-to-end process, but some of the process needs to be automated in order to have that quick recovery from your primary region. So you need to define the RTO, like how fast you want to recover that and how you will be able to achieve that. So with that being said, like in particular in Azure, there are several factors that needs to be evaluated when we say, like the first and foremost is with respect to the region selection, because it's like how you want to achieve your disaster recovery. In Azure, basically, you can achieve your disaster recovery in a separate region, or there are cases where the customer wants to achieve in a metro DR strategy, where they don't have that, they don't want, as they are coming from the on-premise background, and they don't want a longer distance between the two, so they want a zone to be their disaster recovery for, their system is running on one zone and they are achieving the disaster recovery on another zone. So when we are talking about the region selections, so for some customers, it's like they have the compliance that the disaster recovery region should be at a certain distance. So evaluate like whether like because some of the regions in Azure, basically in US region, basically it's separated with thousands of kilometers and all that. So you have to make sure that what basically is can be eligible for you based on your compliance of the business. And if you are trying to adopt the metro DR strategy, where you want like a minimum distance which can be done using zone as well, you can achieve, you can use zone DR, but that is not advisable, because zone DR basically doesn't provide you that wider availability. If there is like a catastrophe or amendment disaster on that particular region, all the zones will be down. So in order to have that actual DR, it's advisable to have a separate region which is running at a certain kilometers or certain distance, so that you are able to basically bring your system in that particular region. So in basically in Azure, there is a concept of paired regions. So some of the regions are being paired to another region. So now when I say the paired region, is like some of the services like Azure storage, which is available in a GRS, like geo redundant storage. Basically, it replicates your storage from the primary region to the paired region, which is basically like suppose one of the region is in US East and another in US West. So now this is basically being a paired region. Now, as this being a paired region, like when you are using Azure storage, standard storage, it replicates your data from the primary region to the secondary paired region. But for SAP workload, you need to consider that this paired region will not be uh, uh, advisable always, because like some of the services will not be available in paired region, like the M series which you are running in your primary region for HANA database might not be available. That particular M series might not be available in that paired region. Suppose Azure NetApp file that is available in your primary region, it may not be available. Azure NetApp file service may not be available in the paired regions. So all this thing needs to be considered, that certain services and will not be available in the paired region. So it's not always advisable to select the paired region just because like you are able to achieve GRS, because the Azure storage standard storage type that basically replicates this that basically offers this GRS is not used by SAP workload. We basically use managed disk and all that stuff. Azure storage is basically not being used here. So also for Azure Backup, so when you are using Azure Backup, the redundancy option that has been default selected is GRS. So if you are having that primary backup in particular region, it is being replicated to the paired region. So there are services which is being replicated to the paired region, but you need to figure out like whether that paired region basically offer the services which can basically run your SAP workload once the failover happens, because as I mentioned, some of the services might not be available in that paired region. So that is like with respect to the region selections, like in Azure, like what all things needs to be considered. And when we go further after selecting the region, then we have to basically see from the networking perspective, like as our virtual network can be expanded to the region, If you are using a different region for your disaster recovery, you have to create separate virtual network. Then you are using any application delivery service. When I take so application delivery service like load balancer, application gateway, and all that, it needs to be created again on the disaster recovery. It cannot be replicated on anything, so it needs to be created again. And when we are talking about the security service with respect to private link and all that stuff, that needs to be created again on the disaster recovery region. So with respect to networking, you need to evaluate, like if you are using express route to the that has been connected to your primary region, you need to make sure that the you have again an express route that basically being a second express route is being connected to the disaster recovery region as well. So if there is an issue on one express route, you can basically use another express route as well.
Dennis, one question. When you mentioned designing that on other side in disaster recovery region, I need to actually have the same replica what I have configured on the primary region. So of course this depends of our RTO or how much time I have, but I can actually leverage also infrastructure as a code. So for example, I can prepare Terraform scripts.
Yeah.
To, if I have enough time, of course, not for express route or something like that, but I can actually construct complete network and everything else.
Yes.
If I have enough time, so I don't need to create that and that I need to pay that on other side. So I can actually build some of that or maybe most of it in Terraform. So if I need to have some disaster recovery landscapes, I can build it on the fly, so to say. Of course, if I have enough time, if my RTO is big enough. Does this make sense to go in that direction? Or?
So basically there are different, this is basically the practice, like how you can basically on the disaster recovery, what all components is required. How you achieve that, it's basically totally on the customer, because some of the customers are very cost centric. They don't want an over provisioning of resources where they are paying it extra, which they are not using it. So they want, like for express route, I think it needs to be created. It's basically advised to create beforehand. It's not like to create at that point of time. But yeah, there are some components like Azure virtual network and everything you can create if you have like a bigger RTO where you can have a day or two to recover the entire landscape. That is something is required. Terraform is basically create the infrastructure landscape, but you need basically a data available on that disaster region.
Yeah, of course. This is just one part. Yeah. Okay.
Yes. So yes, we have a cost. Means I will be walking through. There is a cost optimization solution for, you can use backup restore as well. Okay, so some of the like you can back up your primary like compute or virtual machines or your data on the primary region, and you can recover on the disaster recovery region. But as you mentioned, like this all basically improves the it's increase the RTO. So it depends on the customer, like how much RTO they can afford here. So we are just walking through the different like basically different criteria or different things that needs to be considered. How basically customer wants to achieve it. They have freedom to do that basically based on like what's the RTO and RPO they are able to come across.
Okay.
So going forward, like once like with respect to networking, the component needs to be created on the disaster recovery region. And when we talk about the infrastructure part of compute, like so things needs to be evaluated with respect to the compute is like some of the SKU size that is available on your primary region might not be available on the disaster recovery region. So it may happen that your primary region is running on some M-series SKU, but that M-series SKU might not be available on the disaster recovery. You might need to either increase your use different MCDs or anything, or in general it's not available on that particular region. So you need to figure out like so there is a site where you can basically inspect like whether this product or services or whether this family of VMs is available on this particular region. So it needs to be done beforehand once you're trying to figure out which region will be a good fit for your organization. And basically once we yeah. So, and with respect to this compute, in Azure, you can use Azure Site Recovery. Basically, that replicates your local disk, like the OS disk and the managed disk that has been attached to the disaster recovery. So that will basically, it's more like an automating your replication part, where all the disk will be replicated to the disaster recovery, because this Azure Site Recovery is a useful tool which replicates your basically the entire OS disk and all that. And on you can basically initiate a failover directly from that Azure portal so that your systems basically based on the OS disk that has been replicated, your VMs will be provisioned on the disaster recovery region. So now the thing is, like, the replications of your OS disk managed it doesn't guarantee that the compute will be available at that point of time. So it may happen that you are initiating a disaster recovery for your multiple VMs, and now for certain VM types you are not able to get the capacity in that disaster recovery region. So it may happen that the disaster recovery region might not be able to provide a capacity at that point of time. So you might need to change the SKU size based on like the availability of the SKUs on the disaster recovery region. Or you can, there is a functionality for general purpose if you are using, and if you want like if you want a guaranteed capacity like available on the disaster recovery region, you can use a capacity reservation as well, because there is a concept of reserved instance on the primary region where you reserve the instance for and lock in for certain duration. But on the disaster recovery region, it's not advisable to use, because you are not using the instance there, you are just replicating it. But you can basically do a capacity reservation, but capacity reservation basically will introduce a cost to you for that particular SKU for which you are reserving the capacity on the disaster recovery region. So for critical system, if you want a guarantee capacity on the disaster recovery region, you make sure that you enable that capacity reservation for that particular VMs or SIDs or whatever you are trying to replicate. So that is another option. For database, like from the compute part, as I mentioned, like ASR replicates your local disk. Now, if you are using HANA, you're basically using HANA shared data and log on the primary region, and it can be replicated to disaster recovery. But we don't recommend, and we emphasize, we don't recommend to use ASR for the disaster recovery. For the database, because it's like there are certain limitation with respect to using ASR, because ASR doesn't support the write accelerator, which we usually enable for HANA log. Plus, there is a limitation of the data churn. So as you are basically as HANA is very load intensive, like so many transactions are happening, so there will be data churn on that basically on that particular disk. So ASR is not able to cope up with that data churn and able to replicate it. So we don't recommend, or we don't advise to use ASR for database. Usually for database, we recommend to use a data replication technology that is offered by the database vendor. That's for HANA. You can use HANA system replication for Oracle Data Guard and all that. So that is something you can leverage it, but we don't use ASR for the database OLTP or OLAP database. So also, like as many like for disaster recovery, many of the customers use a different subscription for their disaster recovery. Now, if we are using a different subscription, it may happen that the quota in that subscription might be different. So make sure that the quota that is available is basically covered, so that you don't encounter an issue once you try to bring that system available, because it may happen that quota request will take some time to make it available. So this all things needs to be evaluated beforehand. So it's like you need to have that structure, well documented end-to-end DR strategy in place, where you have evaluated everything from every angle, that that my end-to-end DR strategy works and it is well documented, so that, and we advise it to frequently test this, so that any changes in this end-to-end DR strategy is updated and documented again, and you can have that smooth flow once the initiation take place. So
when you say this, then it's a testing and testing also about the DR testing, so to say. Yeah. Would you, I mean, you can't, I believe you can't execute the DR test on a prod system, well, without in a kind of shadow mode, you know, so to say, to leave the, I believe, to leave the prod system up and running and do a fake test on a DR site.
Yeah.
So from the fact that, I mean, you use the database to replicate it, and then I believe you can't create the isolated environment, right? So if this is the case, then I guess probably a good way would be to have a dev test systems for this purpose, which are kind of replica of a prod system, and use them also for the DR rehearsal, so to say.
I think for dev and QA systems, I won't emphasize on, because some of the customers basically practice to have that DR strategy to at least test once a year or something, so that they are aware that entire end-to-end things are working. Because like dev and QA are basically will not be in the high availability environment, but on production, your entire system is on a high availability environment, and there are certain services and business processes that are not been integrated on your non-production environment. It's only running on the production environment, so that you won't be getting a end-to-end holistic view or detail on how your end-to-end DR will look like. So it's advised like at least to perform it on the production region, like based on like I cannot say like once you set up the DR replication and everything, and you basically initiate after 5 years or something, it may happen something might not be working, because things have changed on the primary region, you have changed certain services and all that stuff. So you need to basically figure out like what will be the good planning rate on testing all this on DR scenarios. Like some of the customers do once a year, so that they are aware that all of the things are working, and it will basically help you refine your RT and RPO, okay, over the period of time. On like if initially you are going with the RTO of 10 hours or something, now if your testing is regularly and all that, and you will get an idea on how you can minimize this RTO. What are the certain areas where you can basically automate much further and basically decrease your RTO. So that way you can basically achieve a lower RTO as well, based on the testing. So my recommendation is like to have like it's advised to have to schedule or to have that end-to-end DR for the production landscape. So at least for months after certain duration. So and when we talk after we like once we consider all this compute areas, like with respect to VM availability, with respect to like quotas and all that stuff, Then what we use basically, what is the most significant thing is the storage that we use for the SAP workload. Storage basically plays a very vital role here, because like there are different storage options that are available on Azure, and there are multiple reference architecture that are supported on different storage areas. So you need to make sure that you achieve the disaster recovery for that particular storage as well. Because this is one of the storage is considered to be one of the a single point of failure as well when we talk about the infrastructure redundancy. So now, as I mentioned, like for Azure storage, standard storage, you have a GRS option available that basically replicates your data on the paired region. But Azure standard storage, we basically don't use for our SAP workload. We use Azure Premium Managed Disk. We use NFS on Azure files. We use Azure NetApp files, Azure shared disk, things like that. Azure Site Recovery basically replicates your managed disk, managed premium disk. So you don't have to do anything additional. Once you enable for that particular VM, all the disk that has been attached, local disk that has been attached on that VM, you can enable using ASR, and that is replicated on the disaster recovery region. But for the shared file system, like with respect to Azure NetApp files and Azure NFS on Azure files, or SMB on Azure files, or Azure shared disk, you need to make sure that all this shared mount points are available, shared disk are available, are replicated on the disaster recovery region, because the replication of this storage are different. Because if we talk about Azure NetApp files, you can use cross-region replication to replicate your replicate data from the primary to the disaster recovery region. It doesn't work like GRS. You need to basically enable the replication, and you need to remount the Azure NetApp file volumes on the disaster recovery region once you initiate the failover. For NFS on Azure files or SMB on Azure files, you need to use a different mechanism, like to copy. Like for NFS on Azure files, you can use rsync to copy your data from primary to the disaster recovery. So you need to provision a secondary NFS on Azure files on the disaster recovery region. If you are using SMB on Azure file for Windows, then basically you need to provision additional SMB on Azure file and replicates the storage using robocopy from the primary region to the disaster recovery region. So you need to evaluate based on the storage what should be the ideal way to replicate the data from your primary region to the disaster recovery region. So that is something which we have mentioned here. So this is basically what I have discussed is this basically formed from the infrastructure redundancy. So I have just touched upon the infrastructure redundancy. It doesn't cover like this all things works fine. Okay, I have replicated everything, local disk, shared volumes and everything. I have created load balancer and everything on the secondary region. Now I'm trying to bring I'm initiating the failover on the disaster recovery region with the local disk that has been replicated. I will be able to bring that VM up. But the thing is, like, my app servers won't be running out of the box, because there are certain changes I need to do at the application layer as well. So that is something which has been basically documented on the second part of that, where we are focusing on what all things needs to be considered at the app layer in order to make sure that your application is running, SAP workload application is running on the disaster recovery, and what are the additional steps that needs to be considered, that needs to be done in order to make sure that your applications are running fine. As I mentioned, like, we are just this is basically focused only on the SAP workload. It doesn't focuses on the other non-SAP components. So you need to make sure based on like what is the advice practice for the DR for different non-SAP component, you adopt that and make sure that also been taken care of. in order for for SAP application, there are certain services that some of the prerequisites like DNS server, AD, and all that stuff. Some of the services needs to be available before the SAP services can be started or something, or servers can be started. So make sure that your AD and DNS servers are available on the disaster recovery region. Now, when we talk about like SAP workload, so there are different components when we talk like SAP Central. Like typically, most of the products that are running, it has a SAP NetWeaver foundation. Okay, then there are components which are basically SAP Business Object or SAP Hybrids, or which are basically a different SAP component that are not running on the NetWeaver part. So now when we focus on most of the SAP NetWeaver component, then there are certain layers like Central Service, Application Server, and Database layer. So now these are the basically from the SAP component perspective. Now there is an additional SAP Web Dispatcher as well. So if you are using all this component, you need to make sure that each layer of this single SAP systems are available on the disaster recovery region. As I mentioned, from the infrastructure perspective on where this application or these layers are running, how you can basically achieve it using ASR and backup restore. But the thing is, like after setting up the ASR, once you initiate the failover, what all things additionally needs to be done on this layers needs to be analyzed and documented. Like if we are using, so let's talk about SAP Central Services. So when we talk about SAP Central Services, there mostly the primary region, the SAP to achieve the redundancy from the hardware failure or anything, the high availability is usually being set up or is being adopted by the customer. So your SAP Central Services will be set up in a high availability environment where your AACS and ERS are running. So if you want a similar configuration on the disaster recovery region where you have where you want an HA setup on the disaster recovery region as well, then there is then you need to focus on certain areas, because central services are running, like let's take an example of Linux. So SAP Central Services HA is being achieved using a pacemaker cluster, which automates the failover of your SAP AACS instance. Now, when we talk about like with respect to the SAP Central Service for SAP Linux for the pacemaker needs a StoneIt mechanism, fencing mechanism. So that fencing mechanism is being offered for Linux in Azure is being offered using different option. You can use using SBD mechanism, or you can use Azure Fence Agent. The setup gets simplified when you are using Azure Fence Agent, because it's a global service that has been basically the apps that has been configured at the tenant level. So you just need to give permission on the disaster recovery region, and there are very little basically if you're using managed identity for your fence agent managed system identity, then that needs to be enabled on the disaster recovery region once the VM is running on the disaster after the failover. Once the VM is running, so managed system identity needs to be enabled, and that you need to basically give IAM roles and all that stuff. So your Azure Fence Agent can be configured using that. But if you're using SBD device using IaaC target server, then basically you need to perform some additional configuration, because the IaaC target server also needs to be replicated on the disaster recovery region. So I have written a blog on that with respect to how you can achieve this for this setup, how you can achieve basically if you're using IaaC target server, how you can basically replicate it and achieve the disaster recovery and have that HA setup on the disaster recovery region. You can basically check that. We have also a blog from Anjan who basically talks about like when you are using Azure Fence Agent, how you can basically achieve the disaster recovery when you are using Azure Fence Agent as a fencing mechanism. And as we have Azure Shared Disk as one of the SBD device, you can use Azure Shared Disk as an SBD device as well for your fencing mechanism. So now Azure Shared Disk is only available in 4 regions right now. So you need to make sure that Azure Shared Disk is available on the disaster recovery region as well if you're using on the primary region. Okay, we don't advise that to change the fencing mechanism on the disaster recovery after the failover. Like if we're using Azure Fence Agent, we don't recommend to use basically Azure Shared Disk SBD on the disaster recovery because it needs to be tested, evaluated, and you don't have time for it to do the testing and all that scenarios on the disaster at the time of failover. So we don't advise to do to change the stonage mechanism, the fencing mechanism on the disaster recovery side. Now, all this SAP MNT mount point or USR SAP file systems are running on this shared directory. That might be an Azure NetApp files, or that might be Azure files, NFS on Azure files. Now, this all files needs to be replicated, or data needs to be copied from the primary to the secondary region. So as I mentioned, that there are different mechanisms to achieve that. Like for NFS on Azure file, you can use rsync, or if you are using Azure NetApp file, you basically use a cross-region replication. So that way you can achieve that. But as mentioned, once you initiate the failover on the DR side, like the VM is available as the local disk is being replicated, you need to change the mount points of all this shared directory, because it is a separate mount point, because you need to provision a different storage of NFS on Azure file, or different Azure NetApp files on the disaster recovery region. So its mount point will be different. So you need to basically remount, or you need to make an entry in the or change the configuration on your in the pacemaker. So we have a resource defined for this file system, which is a shared file system. So you need to update this resources as well as the load balancer. As I mentioned, the application service delivery networking, like load balancer, needs to be recreated into the primary region. So as Robert mentioned, like this all can be automated using Terraform. This all can be created and all that. So it's on the customer whether they need to pre-provision it earlier, or they need to do it create it during the initial when they initiate the failover. So you can create the Azure load balancer and all that stuff. So infrastructure can be created using this Terraform, but you need to make sure that all this thing is updated at the application layer or the cluster cluster layer as well, because in corosync.conf file your IP address are mentioned, which will be pointing to the primary region IP address, and the IP address might be changing in the disaster recovery region. So you need to update that as well. So all this from all this angle, from the application perspective, we have mentioned like what all things needs to be evaluated in our blog, and we have highlighted that. Anything?
So keep it simple, I would say. Keep it simple. Use the Azure fencing agent, so why not?
So even if you use Azure fencing agent, there are some certain things that needs to be, because that only covers the fencing part. Okay, but now you need still update the load balancer resource services, because that will be a separate one. The Azure the port probe, you need to basically update the file system resources and all that. You need to update your corosync.conf file. So all this thing, even with the Azure fence agent, that needs to be changed. Okay, but the only thing simplified with respect to Azure Fence Agent, that you don't have to replicate your entire SBD iSCSI target server on the disaster recovery region, because Azure Fence Agent is a global service that has been defined at the tenant level. So you just need to provide the roles and manage identity, and need to enable manage identity and all that. But additional resource changes needs to be done even in the Azure Fence Agent part as well.
But I think it's really fantastic that you have documented all these different options in the guide, so that customers can really take a look at how do I protect from an infrastructure point of view, and how do I also protect, or what do I need to do from an SAP application level. So I think that's definitely a very good guide.
Yeah. So this basically covers the SAP Central Service. We have a detailed blog on that, and that would be very much helpful for to the customers, like how they can basically achieve that. And now when we talk about the application servers, then application server usually usually might be using Azure SAP MNT and all that, which is shared disk, which is already be taken care when you are designing for central services and all that stuff. If you're using any like for USR SAP Trans, if you're using it, you need to follow the same steps on how they can it can be replicated. Or if we are using a shared disk shared file system for your business data, then basically that needs to be replicated as well. Also means if you're using for application server, most of like your instance are running on the local disk, so you can use Azure Site Recovery to replicate it and basically make it available on that. But all this thing needs to be configured, and as the IP address will be changed or something, you need to update that all that IP address and everything in the DNS and all that stuff. So make sure that the IP address are being updated in DNS if it is getting changed and all that. Now, when we talk about one layer below, the database server. So for the database, as we don't recommend to use Azure Site Recovery, the another approach is to have a database created on the disaster recovery, database server created on the disaster recovery side. Like if we talk about HANA, so deploy a HANA database on the DR side and establish a system replication from your primary. So it can be a multi-tier or multi-target based on which you find suitable for your business. If you want a similar kind of HA setup even on the disaster recovery region, like if you want two set of HANA database, once the once the failover happens on the disaster recovery region, that will act as a primary region, and then you want a secondary region on the disaster recovery region as well, then you can basically achieve that. You can install the separate one, and if you want that automated failover and all that stuff, you can establish you can set up that as well. But it will be much more costlier because running this HANA database on disaster recovery, which doesn't provide any, like it will be running but it's not being used by the business. So based on the business requirement, whether you want a similar kind of HN setup on that or not, you evaluate it. But I think multi-tier or multi-target approach for disaster recovery can basically help you to achieve your database recovery on the disaster recovery region. So we have certain guidelines for all the database that has been used for SAP Workload. So check out that particular guidelines. And then when we talk about like for Web Dispatcher, so if you want the Web Dispatcher, something similar web to be available on the disaster recovery, you can basically, if it is running on an HA environment, just like Central Service, follow the same guidelines, because the setup of SAP Web Dispatcher running on Linux is similar to what you set up for SAP Central Services. So if your SAP Web Dispatcher is basically running as an independent component on a separate server, so similar guidelines needs to be followed for SAP Web Dispatcher. If you are using a single Web Dispatcher, which no HA or parallel Web Dispatcher on your primary region, just use ASR to replicate your both of that to the disaster recovery region, or or you want to replicate only a single Web Dispatcher to the disaster recovery region, you can do that using ASR. So that is all possible. Now when we talk about the business object and things like that, a business object you can basically use Azure Site Recovery to replicate your because business object instance is installed on the local disk. So you can use ASR to replicate that instance to the disaster recovery region. But if you are using input file repository or output file repository of your business object on your Azure NetApp files or Azure files, or SMB files, then basically you need to make sure that that is being replicated and it's been updated once the failover happens of the business object. So Azure Site Recovery basically streamline and smoothens the replication part of your VM. But for database, you can use the vendor technology on how the replication for the database can be done. This is basically like for database, it's basically having that separate server created and all that stuff might be costly for some customer. So for cost optimization, you can use a backup restore as well as a second option. So with respect to backup restore, what can be done is like you can use Azure Backup Services. But the Azure Backup Services, the redundancy option in Azure Backup Services, which replicates your data from the primary to the secondary region, it's done in the paired region as only. So if you are selecting a non-paired region, then basically it's a problem where the data is not replicated into the non-paired region. So you need to basically copy the data from that primary region to the secondary region. So make sure that based on like which region you select, you adopt definite practice on how the recovery can happen. But yes, backup restore basically is second option that can be done. It might be a cost optimized, but that basically increase the RTO of your system, SAP workload. So that's like that's pretty much it that we have covered. So now whether like this is basically what all things needs to be considered. So now if customer wants to automate the infrastructure part using Terraform and all that they can do it, or if they want to create it beforehand, they can do it. But it's advised that all the end-to-end testing are documented and everything is checked, because you need to make sure that the process that is running on the primary region, similarly same process is running on your disaster recovery region without any issue. So in order to achieve that, you need to make sure that your end-to-end DR strategy is working fine, and that can only be said once you test it and once you frequently do it and update your documents, so that operation team is aware on how things can work. And there are different ways to achieve like to set up this disaster recovery. There are different practices to achieve this disaster recovery, like how the setup can be. Like for some customers, they use like non-production environment on the disaster recovery region and production on the another region. So so with the advantage of that is like basically from the operation perspective, people are aware that what all services, that all the services are available on both the region, because your non-production environment also will be using the similar services like Azure NetApp files or NFS on Azure files or anything like that. So you are aware that both of the services are available on both region. How from the operation team perspective, they are aware on how to provision, how to work on that region. You have already selected the minimum distance zones if in the both the regions. So all that prerequisites are already be taken, and people are familiar on like with both the regions. So it makes the transition smooth, and they are familiar with challenges and everything. So this is one. Yep.
Sorry. Yeah. So what I always am reminded there is we had a session with Hans Reuter some time back where he talked about how Microsoft IT is doing that, and he explicitly also highlighted exactly what you just said. So you need to be very, very familiar with this process. So that's why you fail over. I think Microsoft IT fails over, I think, twice a year or something like that, and then it runs also on the DR region to really make sure that all the services are still running, and that not only validates exactly what you said, that all these services are there in the DR, but they also practice all the scenarios.
Yes.
So I think Dennis, also looking a little at the time,
Yeah.
I think you covered a lot of topics already, and I think
Yes.
when I looked at the document, it's really great to see all these different services, all these different functionalities, and the different options. I think you also said it really depends on the customer scenario, like what do they need and what scenarios are they familiar with. So I think that is a very comprehensive guide that outlines what you need to do to set up a good disaster recovery setup.
Yeah, that's our agenda, like to provide basically guidelines on different parts, on how different component that needs to be taken care of with respect to SAP workload, because over the years we have different solutions, different reference architecture for SAP workload now, and everything was in like bits and pieces in different areas. So we try to consolidate in everything into a single in this document section where people can find relevant information, and we will keep on updating all this thing in this section, all the technical details and everything.
Fantastic. And I mean, just maybe as a final example here, like what we see here at the moment, the SAP Database Service, that you have all the documentation. So first of all, it says, yeah, you need to consider SAP Database Service, and then you list out all the different options that are available, and I can just drill down. So I think this is really helpful.
Yes.
Cool, Dennis. Thank you so much for all the insights. I think that was really helpful, and it's clearly that you put a lot of effort and a lot of time in creating this document. So thank you so much for that, and I'm sure this will be extremely helpful for our customers.
Yeah, that's the goal. Yep.
Good. Then thank you so much. Have a nice day, and we'll talk again soon.
You too.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.